You'll never be one of us, my mother-in-law said during family photos, so I pulled out the prenup addendum she forgot existed. The champagne glass slipped from my trembling hands, shattering against the marble floor of the Hamptons estate as those venomous words echoed through the elegant ballroom. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me, some filled with pity, others with barely concealed satisfaction. But it wasn't the humiliation that made my heart race, it was the realization that after 3 years of marriage, I finally had the ammunition I needed to fight back. My name is Maya Rodriguez, and I should have seen this coming from the moment I first stepped into the Whitmore family's world. At 28, I was a successful immigration lawyer from Queens, daughter of Mexican immigrants who had built a modest but comfortable life in America. I met Jonathan Whitmore III at a charity gala where my firm was being honored for our pro bono work. He was 31, devastatingly handsome, and heir to a real estate empire that had shaped Manhattan's skyline for 3 generations. The attraction was immediate and intense. Jonathan pursued me with a confidence that I found both thrilling and slightly overwhelming. Within 6 months, he was flying me to weekend getaways in Napa Valley and introducing me to a lifestyle I'd only seen in movies. But it wasn't the money that won me over, it was the way he seemed genuinely interested in my work, my background, my dreams of using law to help families like mine navigate the complexities of American immigration. His proposal came exactly 1 year after we met, during a private dinner at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date. The ring was stunning, a vintage Tiffany setting that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes without hesitation, caught up in the fairy tale romance of it all. But fairy tales, I learned, often have dark undertones that only become visible once you're living inside them. The first sign of trouble came during our engagement party at his family's estate in the Hamptons. The evening was flawlessly orchestrated, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over perfectly arranged white roses, a string quartet playing softly in the garden, and guests who looked like they'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren advertisement. I felt like an actress playing a role I hadn't auditioned for. Eleanor Whitmore, Jonathan's mother, was the queen of this particular castle. At 63, she was still strikingly beautiful in that polished, untouchable way that comes from generations of privilege and access to the best of everything. She had welcomed me into the family with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, polite, measured, and somehow conditional. That night, she introduced me to family friends with phrases that felt like tiny cuts. "This is Maya, Jonathan's friend from the city." Or, "Maya works with, what was it again? Immigration issues?" How noble. The words were perfectly acceptable on the surface, but the tone carried an unmistakable message: you don't belong here. Jonathan seemed oblivious to these subtle aggressions, or perhaps he'd become so accustomed to his mother's passive-aggressive behavior that he no longer noticed it. When I tried to discuss it with him later that evening, he brushed off my concerns with a laugh. "Mom just needs time to adjust," he said, pulling me close in the guest room of his family's estate. "You have to understand, she's protective of the family reputation. Once she sees how incredible you are, she'll come around." I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe that love would be enough to bridge the gap between our worlds. But as our wedding date approached, Eleanor's behavior became increasingly difficult to ignore. The wedding planning process became a battlefield disguised as mother-daughter bonding. Eleanor insisted on controlling every detail, from the guest list to the flower arrangements, dismissing my preferences with comments like, "I'm sure that's lovely where you come from, dear, but the Whitmore family has certain standards to maintain." When I suggested including some of my family's traditions, perhaps a mariachi band for the cocktail hour or incorporating some Mexican cuisine into the reception menu, Eleanor's response was swift and decisive. "We need to think about our guests' expectations," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The Ashfords will be there, and Senator Morrison, and the Vanderbilts. We can't have them uncomfortable with unfamiliar elements." The final straw came when she presented me with what she called a little family tradition, a prenuptial agreement that she insisted all Whitmore spouses sign. The document was thick, intimidating, and filled with legal language that made my lawyer's brain spin. "It's really just a formality," Jonathan assured me when I expressed my concerns. "The family has certain assets to protect, but it won't affect us personally. My trust fund is separate from the family business, and we'll build our own life together." But as I read through the document more carefully, I discovered clauses that went far beyond simple financial protection. There were restrictions on my career choices, limitations on where we could live, requirements for maintaining certain social obligations, and most disturbingly, provisions that seemed designed to ensure I would never truly have an equal voice in our marriage. The prenup also included something called behavioral expectations that made my skin crawl. I was expected to attend all family events, maintain the family's social calendar, and avoid any actions that might bring disrepute to the Whitmore name. The language was vague enough to give Eleanor enormous power over my daily life. I almost called off the wedding. The night before the ceremony, I sat in my childhood bedroom in Queens, surrounded by the modest but warm decor my mother had chosen, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. My parents, who had worked 2 jobs each to put me through law school, were so proud of what they saw as their daughter's ultimate success. How could I tell them that success felt like a golden cage? But Jonathan found me there that night, having driven out from Manhattan in his tuxedo after the rehearsal dinner when he realized I'd left early. "I know this is overwhelming," he said, sitting beside me on the twin bed I'd slept in through high school. "I know my family can be intense. But Maya, I love you more than I've ever loved anyone. This prenup, these expectations, they're just paperwork. What matters is us, our commitment to each other." He pulled out a small velvet box I'd never seen before. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet with a small charm, a tiny scale of justice. "This was my grandmother's," he said softly. "She was the only woman in her law school class back in 1952. She faced discrimination and prejudice, but she never gave up on fighting for justice. She would have loved you, Maya. She would have recognized that you're the kind of woman who changes things, who makes the world better." In that moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds of my neighborhood, children playing in the courtyard below, the distant sound of salsa music from the Rodriguez family's apartment, the comforting hum of real life, I made a decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I signed the prenup. But I also did something that would prove crucial later. I had my own lawyer add a small addendum that Eleanor's legal team barely glanced at. It seemed insignificant at the time, just a few lines of legal language buried in dozens of pages. But those few lines would eventually become my salvation. The wedding itself was everything Eleanor had envisioned, elegant, expensive, and utterly devoid of anything that reflected who I actually was. As I walked down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my parents' annual rent, I caught my mother's eye in the front row. She was crying, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of joy or concern. The early months of marriage weren't entirely unhappy. Jonathan and I lived in a beautiful apartment on the Upper East Side, and he was genuinely supportive of my career. I continued working at my immigration law firm, and he seemed proud to tell people about the families I helped reunite and the asylum cases I won. But Eleanor's presence loomed over every aspect of our life together. She had keys to our apartment and would arrive unannounced to check on things. She scheduled social events without consulting me and then criticized my appearance or behavior when I didn't meet her expectations. She made comments about my accent, my family, my background that were always just subtle enough to deny if confronted directly. The worst part was how she slowly but systematically began to drive wedges between Jonathan and me. She would share concerns about my career choices, suggesting that representing immigrant families was politically controversial and might hurt Jonathan's business prospects. She questioned whether I was truly committed to the family's charitable obligations, pointing out how rarely I attended the board meetings of organizations I'd never been invited to join. Jonathan, caught between the woman he loved and the family that had shaped his entire identity, began to buckle under the pressure. He started working longer hours, spending more time at his family's office, and gradually becoming less available for the conversations and connections that had defined our early relationship. The breaking point came during what should have been a celebration. Jonathan had just been promoted to senior vice president of Whitmore Properties, and Eleanor decided to throw a family party at the Hamptons estate to celebrate. It was a beautiful September evening, and the estate looked like something out of a magazine, gardens perfectly maintained, the pool area transformed into an elegant party space, and guests dressed in their finest cocktail attire. I had spent weeks preparing for this event, knowing it would be a test of my worthiness as a Whitmore wife. I'd had my hair done at the salon Eleanor recommended, bought a dress from the designer she'd suggested, and studied up on the charitable organizations and social causes that would likely dominate the conversation. Everything was going reasonably well until the photographer arrived to take family portraits. This had become something of a tradition at Whitmore family events, formal photos that would eventually hang in the estate's portrait gallery alongside generations of previous family pictures. As we gathered for the group shot, I naturally moved to stand beside Jonathan, assuming my place as his wife in the family composition. But Eleanor had other ideas. "Maya, dear," she said with that saccharine smile I'd come to dread, "would you mind stepping aside for the family photos? We're trying to maintain consistency with the historical portraits, and—" She paused, her eyes scanning me from head to toe with barely concealed disdain. "Well, you'll never be one of us, so it seems unnecessary to include you in the permanent record." The words hit me like a physical blow. The conversation around us stopped abruptly, and I felt the weight of 50 sets of eyes watching to see how I would respond. Jonathan stood frozen beside me, his face pale with shock but his mouth silent. This was his moment to defend me, to stand up to his mother's cruelty, to choose his wife over his family's toxic dynamics. He said nothing. That's when the champagne glass slipped from my hands, shattering against the marble floor in a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. But instead of humiliation or defeat, I felt something else rising inside me, a cold, calculating anger that reminded me exactly who I was and what I was capable of. "You know what, Eleanor," I said, my voice carrying across the hushed crowd with the kind of authority I used in courtrooms when facing hostile judges, "you're absolutely right. I'll never be one of you. Thank God for that." I walked calmly to my purse, pulled out my phone, and made a call that would change everything. "David? It's Maya. I need you to pull the Whitmore prenup file and meet me at the office tonight. There's a specific addendum we need to discuss, the one about reputation clauses and material breaches of respect." "Yes, tonight. This can't wait." The crowd was still staring as I turned back to face Eleanor, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable as she realized I wasn't crumbling under her attack. "Jonathan," I said, my voice calm but firm, "we need to talk. Privately." He followed me into his father's study, his face a mask of confusion and growing concern. The room was dark wood and leather, filled with the kind of masculine authority that was supposed to intimidate. But I'd spent years facing down immigration judges and hostile government officials. A fancy office didn't scare me anymore. "Maya, I know that was difficult, but my mother didn't mean." "Stop." My voice cut through his excuses like a blade. "Your mother meant exactly what she said, and you know it. But more importantly, you stood there and said nothing while she humiliated me in front of your entire family." I was shocked. I didn't know how to respond. "You respond by defending your wife." The words came out louder than I'd intended, years of accumulated frustration finally finding their voice. "You respond by telling your mother that her behavior is unacceptable. You respond by choosing the woman you promised to love and honor over the woman who's been systematically trying to destroy our marriage since the day we got engaged." Jonathan sank into one of the leather chairs, his head in his hands. "I know she's difficult, but Maya, she's still my mother. This is complicated." "No, Jonathan. It's not complicated at all. What's complicated is the legal situation you've just created for your family." He looked up, confusion replacing the guilt in his eyes. "What do you mean?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the document I'd had my lawyer prepare months earlier, the addendum to our prenup that Eleanor's legal team had barely glanced at before approval. "Remember that little addition I made to the prenup? The one your mother's lawyers said was harmless legal language. It included something called a mutual respect clause. If either party or their immediate family engages in behavior that constitutes material disrespect or public humiliation of the other party, it voids certain financial protections built into the original agreement." Jonathan's face went white as he began to understand the implications. What Eleanor just did, publicly humiliating me, declaring that I'll never be one of you, excluding me from family portraits while 50 people watched, that constitutes a material breach of the respect provisions. Which means the financial protections your family insisted on, they're no longer valid. "Maya, you can't be serious. You wouldn't actually try me." My voice was steady, calm, and utterly serious. "I've spent 3 years being treated like an outsider in my own marriage. I've watched your mother systematically undermine our relationship while you stood by and did nothing. I've tolerated condescension, microaggressions, and outright disrespect because I loved you and believed things would change. But tonight proved that nothing will ever change unless someone forces it to change. I stood up, smoothing my dress, the expensive dress Eleanor had insisted I buy to meet her standards, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Jonathan's voice was panicked now. "I'm going to rejoin your family's party. I'm going to smile and make pleasant conversation and act like the perfect Whitmore wife for the rest of the evening. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to file the necessary legal paperwork to invoke the respect clause provisions. Your family will have 30 days to decide whether they want to continue this toxic pattern or whether they're ready to treat me like an actual member of the family. Maya, please. Let's talk about this rationally. There has to be another way." I turned back to face him, and for the first time in months, I felt completely in control of my own life. "Jonathan, I've been rational for 3 years. I've been patient and understanding and accommodating. I've bent over backward to fit into your family's world, sacrificing pieces of myself in the process. But rationality and patience only work when you're dealing with people who are acting in good faith. Your mother isn't acting in good faith. She's been systematically trying to push me out of this family since the day we got engaged, and tonight she finally said out loud what she's been thinking all along." I paused at the doorway, looking back at the man I'd married with such hope and optimism. "The question now is whether you're going to continue enabling her behavior or whether you're ready to actually be my husband instead of just her son." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, tense family conferences, and difficult conversations. David, my lawyer, was thrilled with the case we had built. The respect clause addendum was ironclad, and Eleanor's public humiliation had been witnessed by dozens of people, many of whom were willing to provide statements about what they'd seen and heard. But the real breakthrough came when Jonathan finally found his spine. It happened during a family meeting that Eleanor had called to discuss the situation, her euphemism for the legal crisis she'd created. The meeting was held in the conference room of the family's law firm, an intimidating space designed to make people feel small and powerless. Eleanor arrived with 2 attorneys, clearly prepared for battle. But Jonathan surprised everyone, including me, by speaking first. "Before we discuss any legal issues," he said, his voice steadier than I'd heard it in months, "I need to address what happened at the party. Mom, what you said to Maya was cruel, inappropriate, and completely unacceptable. She's my wife, she's part of this family, and she deserves your respect." Eleanor's carefully controlled composure cracked for just a moment. "Jonathan, darling, I was simply trying to maintain family traditions." "No." His interruption was firm, decisive. "You were trying to hurt my wife because you've never accepted that I chose her over your list of suitable candidates. You've spent 3 years making her feel unwelcome in her own marriage, and I've spent 3 years pretending not to notice because I was afraid of confronting you." He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that had been missing for months, the strength and clarity that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. "Maya, I owe you an apology. Multiple apologies. I should have stood up to this behavior from the beginning. I should have protected our marriage instead of protecting my mother's feelings. I should have been the husband you deserved instead of the son she demanded." Eleanor was sputtering now, her composure completely shattered. "Jonathan, you can't possibly mean to side with her against your own family. She is my family." The words exploded out of him with years of suppressed frustration. "Maya is my wife, my partner, my family. You are my mother, and I love you, but what you've been doing isn't love, it's control. And it stops now." The legal resolution that followed was swift and decisive. Faced with the prospect of a very public lawsuit that would expose years of documented discrimination and harassment, Eleanor agreed to a settlement that included a formal written apology, a commitment to family counseling, and significant changes to how family events and decisions would be handled going forward. But more importantly, Jonathan and I began the process of rebuilding our marriage on a foundation of mutual respect and honest communication. We moved out of the Upper East Side apartment and into a beautiful brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, closer to my family and my roots, but still elegant enough to meet Jonathan's aesthetic standards. The changes weren't immediate or easy. 3 years of accumulated hurt and resentment don't disappear overnight, and Eleanor's attempts to change her behavior were often grudging and incomplete. But something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamics. The next family gathering was Eleanor's 70th birthday party 6 months later. As we prepared for the event, I found myself actually looking forward to it for the first time in years. Jonathan and I had been attending family counseling sessions together, and Eleanor had been working with a therapist to address what she finally acknowledged were deeply ingrained patterns of controlling behavior. The party was held at a restaurant in Manhattan, neutral ground that felt less loaded with family history and expectations. Eleanor had asked me to help plan the menu, actually listening to my suggestions about incorporating different cultural influences that reflected the diverse backgrounds of family members and friends. When it came time for family photos, Eleanor approached me personally. "Maya," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "would you mind standing next to Jonathan for the family portrait? I want to make sure we capture everyone who matters to him." It wasn't a perfect apology, and I could see the effort it required for her to say those words. But it was progress, and in families, sometimes progress is more valuable than perfection. The photo that was taken that night now hangs in Eleanor's living room, not hidden away in some back hallway, but prominently displayed where every visitor can see it. In the picture, Jonathan and I stand together, my hand in his, both of us smiling genuine smiles for the first time in a family photo. More importantly, that photo represents something that seemed impossible 3 years ago: my place in the Whitmore family isn't conditional anymore. It's not dependent on Eleanor's approval or my willingness to shrink myself to fit their expectations. It's based on the fundamental truth that I am Jonathan's wife, I am part of this family, and I deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The changes extended beyond just family dynamics. With Jonathan's full support, I left my position at the immigration law firm to start my own practice, focusing specifically on family reunification cases. Eleanor, in what I still consider one of the most surprising developments of this entire saga, became one of my first major donors, funding a scholarship program for undocumented students pursuing legal education. "I may not have understood your work initially," she told me during the scholarship program's launch event, "but I can see the difference you're making in people's lives. That's something worthy of respect." It wasn't the warm, maternal relationship I'd once hoped we might develop, but it was something more valuable: genuine mutual respect between two strong women who had learned to appreciate each other's strengths. Jonathan and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary last month with a party that truly reflected both of our backgrounds. We had mariachi music and classical strings, Korean barbecue, and prime rib, family friends from Queens mixing with Manhattan society types. Eleanor not only attended but seemed to genuinely enjoy herself, spending most of the evening deep in conversation with my father about real estate investment strategies and with my mother about the challenges of raising successful children in America. As I watched our families finally coming together in authentic celebration, I thought about that terrible night 3 years ago when Eleanor declared that I would never be one of them. She was right, in a way. I never became one of them by shrinking myself to fit their mold. Instead, I forced them to expand their definition of family to include someone like me. The legal addendum that saved my marriage was just a few lines of text buried in a prenuptial agreement, but it represented something much more powerful: the importance of standing up for yourself, of knowing your worth, and of refusing to accept disrespect even from people who hold power over your life. If you're watching this video because you're dealing with similar family dynamics, I want you to know that you don't have to accept being treated as less than. Whether it's in-laws, family members, or anyone else who tries to make you feel like you don't belong, you have the right to demand respect and dignity in your relationships. Sometimes standing up for yourself requires legal action, sometimes it requires difficult conversations, and sometimes it requires the people who love you to finally choose your side over the comfortable status quo. But you are worth fighting for, your place in your relationships matters, and you deserve to be treated with the same respect you give others. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with others who might need to hear this message. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who refused to accept less than they deserved and found the courage to fight for their place in the world. Your experiences matter, your voice matters, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear when others want you to. The prenuptial agreement that was supposed to protect the Whitmore family's assets from an unsuitable outsider ended up being the document that forced them to treat that outsider with the respect she'd always deserved. Sometimes the very weapons people use against you can become the tools of your liberation. You just have to know how to turn the tables when the moment is right. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be erased from your own story.